Welcome back, everybody, to another Swift programming language tutorial. This is part 7 of our basics series, and in this tutorial we're going to go over functions. So we have 4 examples here. For our first example, we're going to go over a function with no parameters or return values. For our second example, we're going to go over a function with parameters. For our third example, we're going to go over a function with parameters, or that takes arguments, and has a return value. And for our fourth example, we're going to go over a function that takes a sequence of values and does something with those values. Okay, so let's go over our code. To create a very simple Swift function, the syntax looks like this. The first thing you want to do is type out the reserved word or keyword func, which is short for function. Then give your function a name, and then since this function takes no arguments, we just put a set of empty round brackets. Then inside the curly brackets, we tell the function what we want to do. And we want this function to just print out hello. And to do that, we just use the print, and inside the round brackets, we type hello in quotes. Now to use this function, or to call this function, all we have to do is go down here, and since this function already has the print inside the curly brackets, all we have to do is type out the name of the function and make sure that you put the empty round brackets after the name of the function. Now when we run this, this should print out hello to our console right here. So let's go ahead and run it. And you can see the function does what it is supposed to do, and it types out hello. Okay, let's go ahead and get rid of that. Now let's move on to our second example. So this example is a function that has parameters, or that will take arguments. And we want this function to allow us to append elements to an array. So to do that, we create our empty array. Then we create our function here. Once again, we use the reserved word or the keyword func, which is short for function. We give our function the name. And then here, instead of the empty round brackets, we put something in those round brackets, and these are the parameters, and this specifies that we want this function to take arguments. And to set up the code for these parameters, we give the parameter a name. We've given it the name element. Then we use a colon, and then we state the type for that parameter. Then inside the curly brackets, we type out what we want the function to do. So we want this function to reference this array that we created here, and then we use a dot and we use append. And inside the append round brackets, we want to append whatever we pass into this function as an argument, and that would be the element. Okay, so let's go ahead and try and use this function now. Now notice that we said that this function has parameters, or it takes arguments. And typically, parameters are used to describe what goes inside the round brackets here when you create the function, or you could think of that as an argument before it's passed. And then when you call the function and you actually put in the value, that's typically called the argument. But parameters and arguments are also often used interchangeably. So as we mentioned, this function has parameters, or it takes arguments, but it has no return values. So let's show you how that works. Let's go ahead and call our function. Add to array. Now we want to create an element that will be appended to our array1 array. So let's just put in a string, and we'll just say 1. Now when we run this, in this example, you can see nothing really happens. Nothing is printed to the console. However, this function did do something. It actually appended this element here to this array here. You just can't see it yet. Let's go ahead and call this function again. And let's append another element. Let's append the string 2. Let's run it again. So now this 2 should be appended to this array. Now to see that those elements have been appended, we can use a print. And let's put in array1 inside our print. And this should allow us to see the values of array1. And because we used the function twice here, each time to append an element, this empty array should now have the elements 1 and 2 in it. So let's go ahead and show what's in this array by using this print and run it. And you can see down here in the console that our array1 does indeed include the elements that we added, 1 and 2. Okay, so that's an example of a function with parameters that does something but has no return value. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. Let's move on to our third example here. And this function has parameters or takes arguments and has a return value. So the syntax for a function that has parameters and a return value looks like this. We type out func. We give our function a name, and we have given this function the name add2numbers. Then for our parameters, or the arguments that the function will take when it's called, we have put in 2 parameters. The first one is named 1, and then we use the colon, and we state its type, which is an int. Then to put in another parameter, you just use a comma. Then you give your second parameter a name, use a colon, and again state its type. Then, if your function has a return value, after the second round bracket, you use a dash and a greater than symbol, which looks like an arrow, and then you state the type of the return value. Okay, so this function is going to take 2 arguments of type int and return a value of type int. Then inside the curly brackets, once again, we tell the function what we want it to do, and we want it to return. And to allow a function to return something, you just use the reserved word or the keyword return. And we want it to return 1 plus 2, which are these values that we will pass into the function when we call it. So for example, when we call the function, inside the round brackets, if we put a 2 here and a 2 here, it's going to return 2 plus 2 and give us 4. So now let's go ahead and use this function. So let's go down here, and one way to display the output for this function is to use a print. Then we can put our function inside the print, and then inside the function round brackets we put our arguments. So for the first argument in this example, let's put 2, and for the second, let's put 2 again. So let's go ahead and run this, and down here in the console we should get back 2 plus 2, which is 4. And you can see we get 4. We're good to go. Now let's change these arguments, and this time let's put in 10 plus 10. And when we run it again, we should now get 20 down here in the console. And we do, we get 20. Now another thing you can do to use this function is to assign it to a variable. So let's go ahead and create a variable. Let's call it func var. Now let's call our function. So in this case, let's put in 50 and 50. So now we have this function assigned to this variable. And if we want to see the output, we can just put that variable inside of a print. And since this function took 2 arguments, 50 and 50, it's going to add them together, and it should give us back 100. So let's go ahead and run this and see what our print displays. Should be 100. And you can see we get the expected answer of 100. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. So that is an example of a simple function that has parameters and a return value. For our last example here, we have created a function that will take a series of numbers and then add them all together or to sum them. So let's go over our code for this function. Just like before, we use the reserved word or the keyword func. We give our function a name. And what we want this function to do is to take several numbers and then add them all together. So to do that, we use this syntax here. So inside the function round brackets, we create our parameter. We've given it the name numbers. Then we use a colon. We state the type of the numbers that we want this function to be able to take as arguments. And since we want this function to be able to take a whole bunch of numbers, after the type we put 3 dots. Okay? Then after the second round bracket, once again, since this function is going to return a value, we use the arrow, and we want the function to return a value of type double. Then here, inside the curly brackets, we tell the function what we want it to do, and we want it to sum all the values that we pass in. So in order to do that, we create an empty variable here, and we assign it 0.0. And this is kind of a holder variable that will hold all of the different values, so at the very end we can sum them together. Then, to do the actual addition or sum, we use a for loop, which allows us to loop through all of the arguments that this function will take, or all of the values. So it's going to iterate over those values, and then to sum them, we use this syntax here. So notice we use our sum variable that we created here, which we initially set equal to 0, and then we use this modified operator syntax, which will create a running total of all of the values that we iterate over. Okay, so it will start at 0, and then it will look at all of the values, iterate over them, and add them together. And that's why we use a plus equals I, and the I symbolizes all of the values that we iterate over. Then finally we use a return to return the sum. So now let's go ahead and use this function. Let's just keep this real simple and put it inside of a print so we can display our answer. So let's call our function SumArray, and to put in our values, let's put in 5 3 times. So when we run this should give us back 15. Let's run it. And you can see down here in the console we get 15. Now we can continue to add values to that. So let's put in 2 more 5s and a 25. So if I've done my math correctly, now we should get back 50. Let's run it. And we do. We get back 50. We should be good to go. Okay, so that's all we have for this tutorial on how to create basic functions using the Swift programming language. We will be doing many more Swift programming language tutorials in the near future. Join us for those, and we'll see you next time.